Hello, everyone. I would like to introduce myself first. My name is Kaukaba Debani. I'm the Director of Women for Yemen Network. I'm a journalist and also a gender researcher. I'm happy today to moderate this session. And the session is about the future regional and international influence in post-war Yemen. And I would like to introduce you to our esteemed experts and researchers, whom we are hoping that they can cover this topic and also provide us with future analytic of the situation in Yemen. I would like to start with Ali Labsi, is a professor of political science and also a researcher, and William Bell, editor of Arab Digest and an award-winning journalist, former of BBC reporter, and he's also a reporter for more than 30 years. And here we have Jonathan Fenton Harvey. He's a journalist and researcher focusing on conflict and geopolitics in the MENA region. And finally, we have our guest, Stephen Day. He is professor of international affairs at Rollins College in Florida. I would like to ask my guests to start their remarks. The first session will be not more than 40 minutes, and each guest will have 10 minutes in total. I will start with Dr. Ali Alabsi, and we will start with you now. So I hope you're... So in your PhD dissertation, you have come across this topic. I would like also our audience to hear about your how you think you can tackle this theme and your future insight into this topic as well. And this is going to be not more than 10 minutes.
Okay. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أنا كان سنة الدكتوراه تبعي متعلق.
In the name of God, most beneficious, most merciful, my PhD thesis was about the Arab region, studying the impact of the regional forces on the Arab world, whether it is Iran, Turkey, or Israel, and the influence of other Arab powers, including Egypt and Saudi. I have been studying this topic closely and studying the impact of these countries in the Arabian Peninsula and in the other parts of the Arab world. They have always been part of my interest. If we wish to study the influence of regional powers on Yemen, there are many factors. First, why Yemen is so uncovered and exposed to them, to international and regional powers, why it is open to these parties or these countries that do not have this much of power, countries such as UAE, which is considered a small country on the balance of power. In Yemen, our problem has been that we failed to be a real state. There has always been a void through which other countries may have influence, whether it was in the south or in the north. In the south, the National Progressive Front may have built a country, or the government there may have built that, and that system exploded in the 1986, and then we had the war, and we went back to the first square. And in the north, people perceived the state as another tribe, a tribe that represents the president, working for the interests of the members of that tribe. This is why we failed. We always worked, and we have always seen that. Saudi influence in Yemen has always been there, and even during the time of Ali Abdullah Saleh, there has been influence. And during the Jeddah Agreement, according to the Saudi perception that was ratified and signed off by the former president in order to receive the Saudi support to be in power and for his son to be in power, the Saudis requested a strange condition, which is the cancellation of military conscription They requested that military service is no longer mandatory in Yemen. There used to be 90,000 to 100,000 young Yemenis who used to serve in the army, and Yemen has had in the past about 2 million Yemenis on the reserve. The Saudis have always feared Yemen. They've always thought of themselves as the leading country in the Arab Peninsula, and they wish for the other countries to follow them. Yemen was an exception. Yemen was a big country with its size of population, history, and the political movement, because in Yemen we had political parties. They have always been there. They had their voices really heard, and the world was listening. In Saudi, for them, they see that Yemen is the social twin of Saudi Arabia. And the Yemeni state is the only state with a demographic connection with the Saudi state, as there is a population extension from the north of Yemen to the south of Saudi in Asir and Najran and other areas. For example, with other countries, there is a big desert void that separates the population. Saudi has always seen Yemen as a source of risk, and it was waiting. It was thinking that Yemenis were waiting for the right time to influence the Saudis. This is why they have always wanted to have influence in Yemen and to stop Yemen from being a powerful state. This is why they have bought regional loyalties, and they have damaged the efforts of the political leaders, including the efforts of the martyr President Ibrahim al-Hamdi. That regional influence is old. It already exists. In addition to that, regional powers increased. Iran did not have influence. It sought to make gains in Yemen through the export of the Islamic Revolution by the end of the 80s and by the early 90s. And Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president, was blackmailing the Saudis and trying to make up for the absence of Iraq. Yemen was subject to that influence. There was always conflicting parties in Yemen requesting and seeking foreign support. That issue was repeated over and over again. As you know, Yemen, in its history and its structure, has always been subject to regional influence. As we have seen, some see Yemen as a source of risks, like the Saudis. Now they see Yemen as a country that can be contained and controlled. And I think that the Iranian example in Iraq inspired Saudis to do that, so that they control Yemen as a country with a lot of heritage and history. There was a void in power, a void that lacks a strong state and government, and they tried to fill in that gap and to seek their own interests. Western countries saw Yemen in a different way. When we go back to regional powers, there are three main powers. Iran, through its relations with the Houthis, Emirates, and Saudi. There are other countries that may influence him but do not have the desire, like Egypt. Other countries would like to, but they don't have the means and resources and geographical closeness to do that, like Turkey. Internationally, there are two countries, Britain as the Yemeni file and the GCC file is a British file, and in addition to that, there is the USA. If we discuss the British role, we see that Britain re-engineers communities where it wishes to exercise influence. This is why we see that they accept the Houthi role. They do not want to overcome that. And Britain is trying recently to recognize them. The U.S. have always perceived Yemen as a security file, not as a political file. Therefore, most of the senior staff responsible for the Yemeni file in the U.S. government are intelligence officers. And this was very important for their strategy, for their philosophy in the area, which is the protection of the minorities, as they are trying to utilize them in combating Sunni military movements. They know that they cannot depend on government systems, and the regime of Abdullah Saleh utilized the war against extremist violence groups in order to make gains from the Americans and in order to have his son presiding over that force. So the Americans used to solve this through alliances with traditional enemies of those terrorist forces. So there are countries that used to treat Yemen as a risk and now containing it. The UAE started to fill that void and to utilize it in order to have control. Britain wishes to regain its former influence in the area because the Arab area is still the only region where Britain can exercise its great power role. They cannot do that in other parts of the world. They can do that in the Arab world. For the Americans, they see it as Afghanistan with seashores, and they want to have some sort of alliance, whether it's explicit or implicit, in order to have control in combating Islamic movements.
For demonstrating the various agendas of the regional and international powers in Yemen. I would like to move to Mr. William. And as you are a researcher and also journalist for more than 30 years, we would like to hear your inputs in this regard.
Thank you, Kakab, and thanks to Tawakkol Foundation for inviting me to this very important conference. The challenge I've been presented with, and it's not an easy one, so forgive me writing my thoughts down, is to identify chances for the increase or decrease in the influence of regional and international actors in Yemen, given the war outcome. And secondly, to examine possible scenarios for either cooperation or conflict of interest between regional and international actors in post-war Yemen. We are now into the 5th year of a war that began with the expectation of the young Saudi, then deputy, now crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. He believed that using superior air power, he would win a quick victory and cement his reputation as a warrior prince in the mold of his grandfather, Ibn Saud, the founder of the modern kingdom. How wrong, and how terribly wrong for the Yemeni people Mohammed bin Salman was. Joined by the United Arab Emirates and other Middle East states, the war has created famine, disease, internal displacement, and death on an unprecedented scale. And all sides are guilty of atrocities. International players like the US and the UK and France are guilty of supplying weaponry that has destroyed much of the infrastructure, hospitals, schools, water treatment plants, electricity stations of the Arab world's poorest country. And the list of international and regional players is a long one. The US, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the UK, France, Iran, to name but a few. And of course, within Yemen, Houthis, Islahis, Salafists, Saleh loyalists, GPC, tribes, STC, the militias, including the elite forces, security belts, both UAE trained and armed, Republican Guards, special forces, Houthi militias, local resistance to the regular Hadi army, the list goes on and on. All of these regional, international, and local, entangled in a war economy that profits the very few hugely whilst impoverishing the many very greatly. So let me look at the two key players regionally, that is the UAE and Saudi Arabia. To the Saudis first, as my colleague Helen Lackner notes in her forensic and brilliant book, Yemen in Crisis, Saudis for decades pursued a Yemen policy of weakness and strength, funding various groups to weaken central authority while funding central authority to keep it afloat to prevent any one of those factions from seizing control. That policy was run until his death in 2011 by then Minister of Defense Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz. He didn't invent it. It was Britain who introduced the divide and conquer tactic in Yemen as part of its colonizing strategy. And it's a strategy that has produced pernicious results pretty well everywhere that the British Empire left its footprint. Under Prince Sultan, the Wahhabist interpretation of Islam infiltrated and was spread to the detriment of more moderate and tolerant versions of Islam. It was the beginning of the great sectarian divide that has done so much damage to the fabric of Yemeni society, even before the war began. I remember talking to a young Yemeni a few years ago. He was in his mid-20s, and he said to me, when he was growing up, he didn't know whether he was Sunni or Shia. His friends didn't know either, and they didn't care. When the Arab Spring hit Yemen, both the Saudis and the Emiratis were alarmed, as they were by other revolutionary movements that were sweeping away Middle East dictators. Well, it was clear that after 30 years of kleptocracy, Ali Abdullah Saleh had to go. The Yemeni people had had enough. It was equally clear to the autocratic ruling families of the Arabian Peninsula that any sort of successful democratic revolution in Yemen must not be allowed to happen, lest to put ideas into the head of their own subjects. And so a shell game was played out. It involved installing Abdurabu Mansur Hadi as Saleh's, he was Saleh's vice president since 1994, and he became the replacement president. That was a so-called GCC initiative. Under that initiative, there was to be a 2-year transitional phase. Now, neither the Saudis nor the Emiratis, then or now, respect Hadi, so it's perhaps unsurprising they did nothing to ensure the transition period led to real reform. It was a reform they did not want in any case. And as the economic situation in Yemen further deteriorated, and it became clear that Hadi had no clue what to do or any real support from the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Houthis, capitalizing on huge public unhappiness, seized their opportunity. The Saudis, though they shouldn't have been, were caught unawares, and even after Sana'a fell, it took a further 6 months, and the Houthi pushed to Aden for them to react. And as we know, they came in all guns blazing. MBS expected a quick win, so he didn't bother about a strategy or an exit plan. The UAE, on the other hand, under the leadership of Mohammed bin Zayed, the Abu Dhabi Crown Prince, did have a strategy, including an exit strategy. Secure Aden as a jewel worth adding to his port's portfolio, align with southern separatists by creating, training, and arming their militias, support a new South Yemen state that will in effect be a client state of the UAE, and then get out. And the Emiratis got out in the summer of 2019, leaving behind the militias which they are in all likelihood continuing to arm and fund, and leaving behind a long string of human rights abuses for which they have received little public condemnation. In the north, Mohammed bin Salman remains mired in a war he cannot win. The big international players are the US and the UK. Both have heavily backed the Saudi air war, the former providing weaponry and mid-air fueling of Saudi warplanes, the latter bombs, coordinates, and I'm ashamed to say on-the-ground support for the ruthless and at times utterly indiscriminate Saudi bombing campaign that has killed thousands of civilians, helped create cholera epidemics, food shortages for most of the population, and actual starvation for millions more. Let me be clear that while I condemn these outside players unequivocally, I equally condemn the Houthis who have used food and other aid as weapons of war and have deliberately and indiscriminately shelled civilians, leading to many deaths and injuries, as I condemn militias who have carried out multiple atrocities. Were the war to end tomorrow, none of these players are likely to diminish their influence. If anything, the Saudis would seek to increase their influence, backed by the Trump administration, and I fear by the UK, who is so anxious to do deals in the post-Brexit era that it will not want to offend the UAE or Saudi Arabia. I mentioned the Emiratis. have already got pretty much what they wanted, but they will want to ensure that they hang on to their gains in the event that a new South Yemen state emerges. Furthermore, and what makes this such an intractable mess is that the Saudis and the Emiratis each have their own internal Yemeni forces. The Saudis linked to Islah and the Emiratis with the separatist movement. Add to that ACAP, Daesh, tribal and city militias, and that flourishing war economy. It's a very difficult path, very difficult to see a path forward, but look for it, we must. The first step is for the Saudis to declare a unilateral cessation to the bombing campaign. In return, the Houthis must allow the free passage of humanitarian aid to the people of Yemen. The US and the UK should pressure the Saudis into ending the air war by sanctioning the sale of weapons to them, as should France, who continues to supply weapons to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Iran should be told to end whatever support it is providing the Houthis. Diplomatically, given that Mohammed bin Salman wants a way out of the war, the UK, in the absence of any leadership from Trump, should reach out to the Saudis and offer them diplomatic cover to hide their blushes. At the same time, Oman and Kuwait can begin talks with the Houthis, Islahi, Hadi's government, and the strongest and most prominent elements within the southern secessionist movement. Without a doubt, ordinary Yemenis, especially women, who belong to none of those groups, must be an integral part of those talks. The National Dialogue Conference should be rebuilt, working with grassroots organizations, including women's peace groups and civil rights NGOs. Perhaps a new dialogue could look to rehabilitating Hussein al-Houthi's revolutionary social agenda that called for a participatory state of all people and groups, equality for all, and an end to corruption. He was killed along with dozens of his followers on the orders of Salah in 2004, but might his message not be resuscitated and in so doing bring moderate Houthis to the table? The UN peace efforts under Martin Griffiths' leadership have been largely ineffectual, but this does not mean the UN does not have a role to play. It could be supportive of peace efforts initiated by Oman and Kuwait. It should and must pressure the Saudis to halt the bombing campaign. It will continue its vital role to ensure humanitarian aid gets through to the people of Yemen. And it needs to send a message by publicly backing Yemenis women's groups, such as Women for Yemen. All external players, be they regional or international, must work to find ways to end the war economy. War profiteers on all sides should be named and shamed. When the bombing stops and the war ends, external players must secure aid commitments already made and seek out new commitments. A reconstruction committee should be set up, run by leading Yemenis who have worked in civil society and have a proven track record in human rights and peaceful activism, plus those who have business expertise but are not war profiteers, together with Yemeni and foreign experts. The committee will administer the Reconstruction Fund, which will be used, among other things, to hire young Yemeni men away from militias, train them, and pay them to begin the rebuilding of their country. Women will take a leading role in reconstruction jobs. They are vital today in building grassroots peace mechanisms. Their work will become even more important when peace comes. Now, admittedly, it's a huge task repairing critical infrastructure, restoring health and education systems, rebuilding neighborhoods, rebuilding lives and communities, and addressing the critical issue of water shortages. Yemen faces a water catastrophe, which the war has only made worse. But it can be done, and the Yemeni people have the skill and the will and the determination after years of corrupt government, after years of war, to do it. I'm almost finished. When my colleague Helen Lackner published her book in 2017, she began it with a single word: hope. Her next two sentences are these: writing well into the third year of Yemen's international war, I hope, first and foremost, that the war has ended when you read this. Sadly, 3 years on, it has not. But then Helen writes, second, that the end of the war brings a lasting peace and that Yemen's new leadership joins with its people to solve the country's fundamental social, economic, and political problems. It is what the people of Yemen deserve, and it is time they got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. William. And this is very thoughtful, and you have already put some roadmap. And I'm happy that you provided also a gender lens into this discussion. I would like to move to Jonathan Fenty Harvey. You have published a recent research, and it was the focus on the UAE's role in Yemen. We would like to hear from you, and also the other regional powers as well.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Tawakkol Karman Foundation for the kind invitation. So what brought my attention to Yemen initially was how vastly underreported the war was, yet how much significant support there was for this from the British government and the United States, as well as a general air of impunity for what was happening. So that attracted me to specifically focus on what close Western allies were doing in the region, namely Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And since then, I have particularly focused on the roles they have been doing in the country. Yet, I noticed that there was a divergence in this. Obviously, a lot of Western media reports on the conflict as the Saudi-led coalition fighting against the Iran-backed Houthis. So that gives a false impression of what's actually been happening in the conflict. There's actually been a lot of divergence with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, as has been clear fairly early on in the conflict. As the Aden coup in August the 10th last year showed, the two sides were not entirely aligned with one another. Though their alliance is very much still intact and it is going to stay that way for the near future, there is still differences, which has considerable repercussions for the people of Yemen. The country is unfortunately the one which pays the price of these geopolitical interests. So when Saudi Arabia intervened, the UAE trained a significant level of separatist militias and has since empowered the Southern Transitional Council. They have their own geopolitical ambitions in the country, which they have been pursuing. And this has been more highlighted recently, as the Riyadh Agreement has shown, but tried to stop this. So last November, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates came to a fragile truce to unify their preferred sides in the conflict. Since then, there has still been a considerable level of friction and tensions between the two sides. So even though a lot of the deals or the parts of the agreement were supposed to be implemented, deadlines have been passed and neglected. Supposedly, the STC, backed by the UAE, was supposed to withdraw from certain areas, but at the same time, both the Hadi government, backed by Saudi Arabia, and the STC, they still want to take advantage of this deal as much as they can. Effectively, the STC and its Emirati backers still want to consolidate control over the south. And even since this deal has occurred, there has still been a lot of Emirati efforts to undermine it, particularly even though there was a withdrawal of Emirati troops from the city of Aden, there has still been a presence elsewhere in the south, and also in Socotra Island, as we have seen very recently. Emirati militias have continuously expanded their presence there. Abu Dhabi wants to consolidate this island along with the rest of southern Yemen in order to secure its influence over the southern ports and to establish its global maritime trade significantly and empower itself as an economic and geopolitical powerhouse. So that has been continuing a lot since then. And obviously, Saudi Arabia at the same time has been kind of balancing its relationship with United Arab Emirates because it has pursued through its supposed reconstruction programs across Yemen measures to build relations in the south and its influence there and across the north too, as much as it can. So while it presents itself as a humanitarian force in the country, particularly with its development projects, really these are measures to create a guise for its own interests, to secure its own long-term presence in the country, and also to create a form of soft power. So you have that particular element in line with what the United Arab Emirates is doing. But since currently for now, Saudi Arabia could be considered to be in the driver's seat, or at least it was after the Riyadh agreement. But the UAE, particularly driven by its own concerns to maintain alliance with Saudi Arabia, as Saudi Arabia has done, they are seeking to protect this alliance and also consolidate their own influence in the meantime. Both states have driven a counter-revolutionary agenda across the region, as we have seen in Libya, Egypt, and elsewhere. Meanwhile, the UAE has tried to secure its influence in East Africa, particularly in Somalia, where it has supported the autonomous government of Somaliland as it seeks to build a kind of hub or a connection point between many ports here. So if you look at what they're doing regionally, that gives an indication of what they're trying to achieve in Yemen as well. But again, as I say, it is Yemeni people that pay the price for this significant level of them pursuing their own interests. Meanwhile, the UAE has tried to present itself as standoffish in the conflict. As we saw in June last year, the UAE declared it was withdrawing its troops from the south of Yemen and from the conflict in Hodeidah, but it still kept a significant militia presence. And then after the Aden coup, it had consolidated more support for the militias, and quite blatantly, it had carried out an attack on government troops and with airstrikes to consolidate their own stronghold over the south. So that showed that there was a significant desire for them to help maintain the SDC's control in the south. And going forward, this is going to leave a really unstable form of governance in Yemen, because there are no legitimate efforts to actually secure a strong state in Yemen and to bring about an end to this significant level of interference. Europe and the rest of the international community has backed off considerably after the Riyadh agreement. The EU praised Saudi Arabia for its supposed peace efforts, while it was merely seeking to shore up its own influence in the country. So that has given rise to a lot of further tensions in the south, particularly as there are no strong efforts to actually pursue peace in the country. And this is very reflective of what's been happening throughout the war. I mean, obviously Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates wouldn't have been able to pursue their military campaigns in the north and the south if it wasn't for this tremendous level of Western support and impunity. So while this continues, while there is a significant level of silence from the West towards what Saudi Arabia and the UAE is doing, there is going to be a hard chance of actually securing a peace solution in Yemen, because Saudi Arabia and the UAE will just have a completely free rein to continue pursuing their own ambitions, which leads to more instability in Yemen. And particularly as there has been a rise of populism in the West. In Britain, we now have Boris Johnson, and in the United States, Trump is also considerably in favor of supporting Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and maintaining a close relationship with them. Both countries, incidentally, are doing this for the sake of profit, largely. This is going to create significant problems, and it is unlikely that this will be fully addressed within the near future. Meanwhile, it will just lead to the continuous carving up of Yemen. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, in the meantime, will consolidate their alliance, but in the future, particularly as violence could erupt, the Riyadh agreement isn't entirely stable. There are still tensions over Aden. Recently, the separatist forces, the SDC forces, had refused to let Hadi government troops re-enter, and there are tensions over other governorates like Shabwa. this could lead to a breaking down of this deal, and there will be further tensions. In the future, we may see more friction between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, particularly as they might argue over what they want to achieve in the country. But in the meantime, as I said, unless there is further pressure for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to actually pursue a legitimate solution for Yemen, it is this country that is going to pay the price of their geopolitical aspirations. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan. You have brought also a new insight into the Riyadh Agreement because it's a new in the political scene in Yemen. I would like to move to Stephen Day, and I would like, based that in light that you have already co-edited a book with the same topic that we're discussing, we would like to contribute with us from the lessons learned or the important feedback you've got.
Yeah, certainly, and I appreciate the opportunity. I want to thank Tawakkol Karman and the foundation for including me in the conference. And as you mentioned, Kokab, I recently co-edited a book. The title is Global, Regional, and Local Dynamics in the Yemen Crisis. I co-edited the book with a colleague in London, Noel Breheny, who is, I believe, the former head of the British Yemeni Society. I was really fortunate to be able to work with Noel on the book because it was a cumbersome task. I've never tried to take on an edited collection like this with so many authors and chapters of the book. It took 2 years to put the book together. And it just happened to come out last month, so the timing is very good. In fact, this is my first time to talk about the subject of the book in the context of a conference such as this that is really addressing the same issue. So it's really fortunate for me to have the opportunity. I'm not sure, because the book is lengthy, I'm not sure I can give a summary analysis of the book and say, in addition to that, what is my view of the future within the 10-minute time that I have at the beginning. But I did think, to start off with, it's best if I provide the audience background on what's in the book, and then there will be some understanding of why I'm reaching conclusions that I do about what is the best way moving forward. How could you look for international assistance to bring about a peaceful settlement within Yemen? The book is divided into 3 parts along the basis of the title. There's a section on global actors within Yemen, a section on regional actors within the Middle East, and then local actors inside the country. Among the global actors, and each of these actors has a chapter in the book, we included a chapter on the United Nations, the role that it has played since 2011 until today. The UK, the US government, the EU, as a collection of governments, but also as the institution of the European Union, a chapter on Russia, and a chapter on China. So those are the global actors that are analyzed in the book. At the regional level, we have chapters in the book about Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Iran, Oman, Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, Sudan, and other countries along the African side of the Red Sea. And then in the third part of the book, we have 4 chapters on local actors, and we addressed these actors within Yemen in a lot of ways, as Jonathan described, the different, in a way, proxy relations you have between local actors in Yemen and sponsors outside the country. But we have a chapter on what's referred to as the legitimacy group within Yemen, President Hadi, and supporters or allies within the recognized government that have relationships with the Islah Party. Then there's a chapter on the Houthi, and we linked former President Saleh with the Houthi in this second chapter on local actors. So it's the Houthi and the Saleh group with a sort of split analysis between the two. And then there's a chapter on Iraq and the Southern Transitional Council in the south. The final chapter is a chapter on Salafi groups, particularly organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda that operate inside the country. The purpose of the book, and particularly for a conference like this, is to try to understand what's happened in the past, why we're in the situation that we're in today, what have been the causes of the dynamics between the various actors that are involved in the crisis in Yemen, and then based on that understanding, how do you see that you could move forward in the future? There's a Japanese film from the 1950s, a very famous director named Akira Kurosawa produced this film called Rashomon. And the perspective of the film is that you can gain insight about the reality of a situation if you look at it from different perspectives. And in some ways, that's what the book does. We asked each of the authors to present an analysis within the chapter from the point of view of that actor. Now, if you read the book in its entirety, in some ways you have to read between the lines of the chapters because it is exactly like Kurosawa's film, Rashomon. But certainly there's an understanding that comes out of this Rashomon-like effect of the book. To talk about how you can draw conclusions from the book and what would be best to happen in the future, I would address, first of all, this assumption that outside actors can find a way to negotiate a peaceful settlement within Yemen. My own view is that it's got to come from the inside. It has to come from Yemenis. But obviously, there should be a role of outside, particularly through the United Nations. 2 years ago, the UN Special Envoy, Sheikh Ahmed, when he stepped down, he made a statement that's quoted in the book where he said, "We do have a roadmap for Yemen. The only part missing is the commitment of parties to make concessions and give priority to the wider national interests." And I would say that that's generally been true over the last 2 years. People know what has to happen. The question is, how can you get all of the parties that are involved in continuing this tragedy in Yemen to give that commitment to make it happen? As he said, we all know what needs to happen. The problem, as I see it, is largely at the level of the regional actors that are addressed in the book. In fact, the authors who contributed chapters in part one about global actors largely concluded that unlike the past and unlike decades throughout the 20th century, there was largely agreement among all of those global actors about the transition in Yemen after 2011. Even up to the moment of the coup in Sana'a in September 2014 and the beginning of war in the early months, there was a basic agreement between all of those large global actors that obviously among them include permanent members of the UN Security Council. And I would say that the Russian position at the beginning of the war, they abstained on one of the post-war resolutions that was calling for an end to the fighting, signaled that there was a possibility of division between the global actors there, but it wasn't a serious problem. So again, my conclusion based on what we found in the book is that it's largely that issue at the regional level. I see that I have a little bit more than a minute, but as I said, I may not be able to get to the full conclusion, but I can follow up in later time that I might have. But let me say that my view of that at the regional level, and I largely agree with what Jonathan just said. What are the problems with regional states that in a sense have a proxy relationship with local militia groups on the inside that are perpetuating this war? And I would say that one of the keys to this, and I can come back hopefully and make the point, is that it's very important to understand how the regional actors, namely the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the government of Iran to a lesser extent, everyone knows that the Houthi are largely a local initiative within the country. They didn't really depend upon Iran to do what they did, but Iran has benefited, and Iran has maintained that relationship with the Houthi. But the important point is to understand that all of those regional actors have ulterior motives. I think it's clear to everyone, if you thought about it, in terms of which group on the inside that controls what piece of territory within Yemen, those regional proxy sponsors of these local groups, they're not really interested in trying to help those local groups. They all have ulterior motives. So the point that I will eventually make when we get around to commenting is to think strategically about what those ulterior motives are and find ways to unify agreement among Yemenis that can maybe exploit some of the differences among the regional players that are very clearly pursuing their own ulterior motives in the Middle East.
Thank you so much, Mr. Stephen. And I would like to thank you for this thoughtful session. And in the next session, it will be 20 minutes maximum. But in this session, we'll follow up on some of the points that you have already mentioned. But I would like to challenge you, because what we have heard so far is more of analysis of the situation. But I would like to, Yemenis would like, because today we want to think about the future of Yemen. As I understand from all of you, there is different agenda, there's different, let's say, negative interest in Yemen. How we can find a united agenda or a pro-Yemeni political agenda in Yemen, how we can work, or politicians or the politics in Yemen can work towards this agenda so Yemeni can build their future. I will start with Dr. Ali, because you've already started to talk about how the UK should have handled its relationship inside the region, and you think it will have a bigger role. So I would like if you can continue from that point, or whatever you think it's more suitable.
أنا كما فهمت إنه نبحث عن ماذا يمكن.
So as the discussion was saying that there are a lot of agendas in Yemen and that we have different interests in Yemen. So how can we find a Yemeni agenda and a Yemeni political agenda that we can work on? You mentioned how the UK was doing a positive role in the region. So please build on this point, or let's flesh this idea out, because we're trying from this session to come out with a forward-looking from this. I didn't say that they have a positive role in the past in the UK, but maybe they can play some role in between the Arabs. But I don't think that. But other states, they don't take care about, or they don't have any interest in Yemen or in the region, the Latin American countries or the European countries. So all these countries, they are not charities. When they intervene in anything that happens in Yemen, they are looking for their own interests. This is something very visible, and the Yemenis themselves must know that. They must learn, or they must try to impose their own agendas and to deal with this exposure of the Yemeni issue in the hands of the other countries, regional or international countries. Why did we allow the Saudis or the Emiratis to have their agendas in Yemen? There are a lot of conflicting interests amongst Yemenis themselves that's led to this proxy war in Yemen. How can we solve the root causes of this amplified influence in Yemen. I believe that Yemenis need to be unified, but it is just a word, a mere word. On what are they going to be unified? We need a project and we need a commander or a leader to lead that project. Basically, there is initially there is a project which is the federal state and the constitution of Yemen and the national dialogue. There are some observations or some amendments that we need to make, but the project is there that we can work on. The issue is not about the persons or individuals, it's about the principles that Yemenis can agree on. Right now, this is not present. Why? Because of the heritage that we have in the Yemeni state. It was an individual heritage. Each leader was looking for his own prestige or the prestige for or the interests of his own family or tribe. So we didn't reach the political identity of the Yemen that all Yemenis can relate to. We are all Yemenis, but the one unified political identity or project is absent, has been absent all over. So what we need is we need a leader. How can we create this leader? I believe that the individual leadership is over in Yemen. Looking for the hero is not applicable anymore in Yemen. Those heroes or these leaders are killed once they appear. Right now, we need a collective role, collective awareness, and a group of elites, political elites. I was discussing with some of the colleagues, what can we do? My own perspective to solve the problem in Yemen is that we need to recognize that there are enemies that we need to deal with. I can't see that Houthis are a party or a partner that we can deal with. They are an enemy. We hope that they were a political one, that we can have a political initiative with them or a political talks with them. They are an enemy that cannot be discussed or talked to. This is something that we need to recognize now. That's what I was. That's the discussion that we have had with my colleagues, is to have a shadow government for the forces that are outside. Let's create an alternative government, not replacing the legitimacy group, but just to. Not to get into side skirmishes. Just let's do that tour, for example. If that is the legitimate government, that's fine. Let's use this legitimacy notion that is supported by international resolutions. So we can create a shadow government, a parallel government that works with the legitimate government, but with a different performance. Just like what happens in the UK, for example. There is a government, a shadow government, that deals with the issues that they have in the UK differently. So we can engage with activists, with experts, in order to agree on a political project that can be an alternative for the international community to deal with. Right now, we cannot eliminate the regional influence in Yemen without having an alternative project. The legitimate government cannot deal with itself or make its own decisions. So we cannot expect any country in the world to move or to support us because they are completely under the Saudi influence. So I believe this is something that we can discuss and improve this idea to have and to see how this shadow government can be. To have the ministers, for example, a foreign minister that is acceptable to explain the Yemeni issue to the world. It is a very big topic, but we can talk about that.
You mentioned the most two important points, which is finding national solutions, not alternative solutions, and limiting foreign influence so that we can elevate the politics of Yemen.
Women's role, and you think it is very essential for the politics in Yemen. I would like to build on that and say how you think the regional global influence can help women's political participation. What should be done to ensure that?
Yeah, I think there are so many problems that the tendency is to focus on the problems, and I think that there are opportunities and there are largely untapped resources. And I firmly believe when I look at what women, Yemeni women, are accomplishing, that they are an untapped resource. And I think particularly at the grassroots, peace negotiations, negotiations to achieve the release of aid, to allow the release of prisoners. Women are doing this at the grassroots level. This is the sort of thing that has become impossible at a larger level. But at a micro level, across the country, in communities small and large, this is happening with women. I think it's very important, if you're going to look for solutions that we all want to have, that we look at untapped resources. Women have paid an extraordinary price. Everyone has paid a price, but women have paid an extraordinary price for this war. They have found themselves in a situation where the husband has gone off to join a militia. They are left as the person in charge of the family. They're responsible, where I mentioned about the water catastrophe, they're responsible for trying to secure clean drinking water. They are carrying on jobs in a largely patriarchal society where that is frowned upon. They're often subjected in the streets to forms of abuse. So we need to find ways to support women. And by we, I mean Western governments. I mentioned that the UN should be acknowledging the absolutely crucial role that women are playing in trying to move this process forward. And I appreciate it's a difficult argument. I'm from the West. You could say my wife runs the family. There is a belief that women are equal in the West. This is a belief that will take time to embed in other societies and other cultures. But it needs, I think, to begin, and it needs to happen in Yemen, because I honestly believe that that is one of the ways out of what is otherwise an intractable mess. And I spoke about hope, what my colleague Helen Lackner spoke about. Hope is a resource that is very, very precious. And it's easy to sink into despair. Hope, there is hope, and I believe that there's hope that can be tapped, and that hope can be brought to fruition by involving and engaging women more directly. I think women need to be at the conversations. I was at a meeting last year where young Yemenis who'd come in from Sana'a and from other cities, and they were describing the difficulties they were facing. And one of the criticisms of Martin Griffiths was that in Stockholm, the women were completely marginalized. That is, the people who were most heavily affected were not being listened to. We're not even at the table to have the conversation. That has to stop. It is absolutely imperative that international organizations, international governments, the media begins to focus on women. Why? Because they offer a road forward.
Okay, thank you so much. And Jonathan, you have tapped on the UAE influence. And as I said at the beginning, the challenge here is to bring forward political tactic that will support Yemen. How do you think Yemenis can turn these politics into their favor? What is the future tactics, political tactics, from your point of view?
Well, I think one of the things that could happen is that Yemeni organizations try to separate themselves from the divisive role that the UAE-backed SDC is playing. Because ultimately, even though I understand there is support for it in the south, it is being used and utilized to serve the UAE's ambitions. Ultimately, though, I think if you're talking at it from a local level, there's still, as we've often discussed today, there needs to be a lot more ending of external support for what's actually happening in the conflict, particularly as the Riyadh agreement has largely marginalized a lot of what's actually trying to be done for Yemeni people, because you're imposing the Hadi government and the UAE-backed STC. So that drowns out a lot of legitimate Yemeni voices who are trying to represent themselves at the same time. So I still think that Western influence in the conflict is very crucial for this, particularly as they are giving a considerable amount of support for these two countries. And without actually ending this kind of external interference in the country, which is drowning out legitimate voices, there is actually very little hope that we can bring about a positive solution from the people themselves. Obviously, there is still the potential move to distance, for Yemenis to distance themselves from these kind of organizations, but currently the STC and its aligned militias have a considerable hold over the south of the country. And that, even though there have been southern groups who are resisting, particularly in places like Hadramaut, and there are a few in Mahra too, that has provided some sort of challenge, but at the same time, it is very unlikely that it will lead to more positive representation from these individual factions themselves. So really, there will be more divisions and conflicts because of that. As I've said, the South is far from united as one homogeneous bloc. So trying to impose one significant bloc over this region is going to have consequences. So really, we need to focus more on pushing Western countries to ending their support for the United Arab Emirates, because that's, a very divisive factor in the conflict. Without that, we cannot really move forward, and this humanitarian crisis, which is only getting worse, that's one thing the Riyadh Agreement did not significantly address, the humanitarian suffering of Yemenis themselves. It was more about shoring up these two significant political actors, the Hadi government and the UAE. So ultimately, it is the people of Yemen who have suffered considerably throughout this war, and their voices are being neglected. So that is one thing that needs to change. There needs to be more addressing of that to actually move forward.
And do you think the Western or the international community can be convinced to cut the support to the UAE? How do you think this should be also addressed?
There needs to be, first of all, particularly since Saudi Arabia has commenced some air operations in the north of Yemen recently, there needs to be a cutting of weapon supplies. That would send more of a statement to actually pushing both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to going towards the negotiating table in the conflict. And at the same time, there needs to be more pressure, more condemnation, because the UK is supposedly the penholder of Yemen in the United Nations. Yet whenever it has filed a resolution in the conflict, it has often been aimed at condemning Iran's role, which, while is important considering that the Houthis and Iran have been moving together throughout the conflict, particularly last year, it really misses a key crucial point in this scenario, in this situation. So there needs to be ending of material support and more condemnation and criticism of it to actually force a more viable solution.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I would like to move to Stephen. You said you have a follow-up comments and feedback.
Yeah, and
so
let me comment as well on what others have said, and I agree essentially with all of the points that have been made. I like the idea that Ali suggested of people outside Yemen trying to form a kind of shadow government in a way, and involving women, as Bill said, and getting youth involved in it. I think that there is a place for that. It actually could be a lobby, a kind of pressure on international actors. I would probably focus more on the line of thought that Jonathan had with respect to what the outside actors are doing in a very damaging way to keep the conflict and the crisis going. And that's what I was originally hinting at, is that it's necessary to understand what those ulterior motives are. So I want to say a little bit about that. I guess I forgot to mention one thing that was said earlier, and I'm certainly a big proponent of this. I've always been a big proponent of this, is that there has to be some kind of discussion of this federalism issue within Yemen. I was a proponent of that back in the 1990s before you even had the question come up at the time of the protests in 2011. So I do think there's a way to kind of form some sort of outside bloc around that issue of federalism, get the international community to back that and say, look, this was the solution that was drafted at the National Dialogue Council. It doesn't have to be as it was put forward at the time. I think there are ways to adjust it. I wrote a piece on this issue about 8 months ago, and it was published on a major foreign policy site in Washington, D.C. that the Middle East Institute publishes. And I've been trying to make that argument with many government leaders. I have to say that in Washington, D.C., most people, the response I got was, well, that's passé. That was what people were talking about 2012, 2013. My point is that you can't really envision what the end point is going to look like unless you take that issue seriously. So I think there is a way to kind of build a path forward on the basis of that idea that Yemen has to find a way to make room for decentralized decision-making, whether along the existing provinces or the regions, I don't think it matters. Now, on the question of ulterior motives of outside players, let me say very quickly that one of the things that comes out of the book, and I think it's in the chapter that we added late, this chapter on what's the view on the other side of the Red Sea. The author who wrote that chapter, Alex Duvall, is an expert on Ethiopian and Eritrean as well as Sudanese politics. And he makes this point, as it also came out in our chapter on the UAE, that Abu Dhabi and Dubai are very clearly pursuing a strategy of controlling ports and sea passages into the Red Sea. I mean, the UAE is affecting port activity in Djibouti and as well as in Somaliland. I think that issue has to be understood that, look, this is a key player in keeping the conflict going, that they very clearly have this ulterior motives. And so people have to emphasize that point and find a way to get the government in the UAE to stop interfering in Yemen because they have this other outside motive. And I would say the same thing is true about the Saudis. Everybody understands that the Saudi government has for a long time had this ulterior motive towards territory within Yemen. I mean, to keep it weak, to keep it divided, but very clearly they have been pursuing an agenda in the eastern provinces, in Al-Mahra and Hadramaut. This point needs to be emphasized by the international community, that these outside players that look at this as an opportunity, because there's a war and conflict in Yemen, to get the benefits that they have long held, I think has to be emphasized. There has to be a way for world leaders to emphasize that point.
Okay, thank you so much. We have finished our session and we will open now the session for questions. And I would like to ask everyone is to get benefit of our experts and try to ask them about future analysis as well. And also I would like to ask you to keep your questions short. And if you have any comments, not to be more than 2 minutes maximum. This session will be 20 minutes total. I would start, and I would like to see, because also my panelists say they want to see also more women in amongst the audience. So I would start with the gentleman here.
In the name of God, the most merciful, the most beneficent. First of all, let me borrow this place for this room to be the Yemeni Republic so that I can welcome my European guests. I would like to tell you that this war started in 1997 during the times of the corrupt, fake elections that were supported by their governments. Therefore, we want them to warn the community members before the governments that the Yemeni Yemeni population was wronged and the Yemeni state wronged them, and we discovered that 30,000 members of the state were receiving monthly salaries by the state. As per the Yemeni law, it was great treason. But one of those people who used to receive those salaries was the Yemeni president, Ali Abdullah Saleh. The tribal heads and the religious sheikhs used to receive these from the Saudi state. We have discovered that the Yemeni ports were leased to the Emiratis. We had suffered from the geographic curse. I would go back to Mr. Ali's. I think that based on what he said, that there should be initiatives such as this Tawakkol Karman Foundation initiative. It is part of the solution. We want similar solutions. We want similar things. We don't have a problem with Yemeni women. Women in Yemen didn't have problem driving cars, and as you have seen, Miss Tawakkol Karman was of the first people to resist Ali Abdullah Saleh refusing that he gives the presidency as inheritance to her son. In conclusion, we demand youth initiatives to work on what Mr. Ali mentioned. I would like to comment on what Ali Al-Absi noted. The real initiative is to find solution. The problems is known, or the problems are known by everybody. I second the opinion that we should enhance social initiatives and community initiatives based on social responsibility, by strategic partnership by everybody, by not being affiliated to any party or entity, and that it is based on honesty. There are initiatives that are maybe 10 years or more old. There are projects, and there are some entities that know it, others who don't. Most the leaderships in Yemen know about this initiative. It is an inclusive, comprehensive initiative for providing a national support in order to have social partnership that contribute to finding solutions in Yemen. Thank you.
Because he emphasized on the role of the Yemeni women. And I will just add something, that because the Yemeni militia and the Yemeni people, they know how the rule of the Yemeni women is very affected. That's why they start, especially the Houthi militia, to attack the all Yemeni activists, whether inside Yemen or outside Yemen, except the women who's working in the some NGOs. That sometimes they explain the militia Houthis as a political party, not as a militia that has no relation with the policy. This is what I wanted to say for Mr. William Harry, and I would like him also to know that what's happening to the Yemeni women, that they are really trying to make peace. At the same time, there are women who are like any men who's trying to explain the crime of their parties. Of course, this is at the end they are human. They have their benefits. they are working on that. In general, in the history of Yemen, Yemeni women has ruled for making peace, and again, I'm emphasizing of there is another war against the Yemeni women because they are totally afraid for their strong benefit and strong rules. Thank you, Mr. William.
Thank you so much. We take from this. That's good. We take from here.
Assalamu alaikum.
Peace of God be on you. We thank the foundation for this great initiative. I've been here since the first session. It is out of context. The title that was put for the forum or the seminar is outside of its context. What was been discussed is not related to that title. We are suffering from conflicts. It was a big war, and now we're seeing sub-wars inside it. We are talking about post-war scenarios, and we are still amidst war. Everything that was discussed was about what took place during the past period. However, we were not able to overcome this obstacle of war. We cannot do that due to the difficulties and the complexities of Yemen currently. Just like Dr. Abdul Wahab said, we're suffering from the curse of geography. This led to international and regional wars interfering in our situations. Yemenis across history had short wars, but long wars like this. It is similar to the war between the royalists and the republicans in the 70s of the past century, but now we're seeing the warring parties between the local, regional, international factors, in addition of the Republican royalist wars. Just like you had, the war in Yemen is not a Sunni-Shia war. The war in Yemen is a war of national interest. It is based on the idea of the republic, the idea that Yemenis have suffered a lot and sacrificed a lot for until now. They are still suffering for it. What Mr. Ali Al-Absi said about it is that all the alternatives that come from outside Yemen will not be successful unless they come from initiatives taken from inside Yemen, from the actual players inside the country. Otherwise, they will be failures, because everything that comes from outside will be failing, because all the international, regional powers have contributed to the failure and contributed to making Yemen a market of weapons and a place of wars.
Is to answer why we're talking about the future of Yemen from now. What is its significance? How it is, why we think we should speak about the future from now, though the war is going.
Well, I think that it's important to talk about the future. I think it's important to look at ways forward. I've addressed one aspect, which is tapping into the under-resourced power that women have. I've suggested that when the bombs stop falling, that there be a reconstruction committee, if you will. It's easy to smash things up. It's hard to rebuild, but I do think that that's part of the healing process. And of course, there needs to be pressure brought to bear on the outside players. There's no question that it is a difficult challenge, particularly given who is sitting in the White House today. We can only hope that will change, and that may create an opportunity. I also want to pick up on the potential that Stephen spoke of to exploit some of the tensions, and you addressed it too, with some of the tensions between the Saudis and the Emiratis. It is clear that as far as the Emiratis are concerned, that they are content with the status quo, that is, with continuing the war. It is not at all clear that Mohammed bin Salman is content. In fact, it is quite the opposite. He wants to find a way to end the war. It's costing him, it was mentioned earlier, hundreds of billions to prosecute this war. And as the price of oil is dropping dramatically with coronavirus, he is getting more and more anxious. So I think that there needs to be pressure brought to bear on him. And as I said earlier, the first thing that needs to happen is there needs to be unilateral cessation to the bombing. That then puts the pressure on the Houthis. They have got to open up to the release of humanitarian aid. They've got to stop the war profiteering. That's on their watch. The Saudis could even put a timeline on. Do this, or we will do some selective targeting. None of this has been discussed in any way. That's the pressure points, and the UK does have a role to play. If we weren't so completely drawn into this whole Brexit mess, then we could be focusing out and doing something positive for Yemen for once. And that positive could be pushing the Saudis towards a unilateral cessation of the bombing. I think we have to project out, we have to look out beyond where we are today, and we have to, focus on the positives and the hope, and try and build on that. And I think that as a journalist, my job should be to focus on putting pressure on the UK government, for example. It's not acceptable what they are doing with Yemen. It's not acceptable in any way, and that needs to be challenged.
Okay. Stephen wanted to contribute.
Yeah, I will follow up on the comments I made before, that I think it's very important to think strategically about the power dynamics around Yemen. And like Bill was saying, find ways to exploit divisions and differences on the outside. I mean, that's what the outside players are doing. They're thinking in terms of what are those conflicts and divisions within Yemen, between Yemeni groups. I think the reality is that there are opportunities for Yemenis, some sort of group that would be a type of lobby to try to bring about a change in the status quo currently inside the country. I mean, if you just look at the global level, the way that things are changing globally, this whole question of the rise of China, a greater role that Russia is playing. Although I have to say, as an American, I agree with Bill, as long as Donald Trump is in the White House, you're not going to see any kind of progress from the American perspective. I mean, his government is just dismal when it comes to this question of how do you think constructively about international problems. His administration is all about how do you exploit the relationship with the Saudis and the Emiratis. So they're totally listening to MBS and NBC and doing whatever they want when it comes to something like Yemen. So the first thing from the American point of view, the best thing that could happen is if Trump loses this upcoming election in November and there's somebody better than him. But I do think there are these opportunities internationally that need to be thought about as well regionally. I mean, for Yemenis, one of the things I would say to think about why there is this perpetuation of a state of crisis within the country, put it kind of in a historical perspective and think about what used to be the regional environment within which a Yemeni government operated. One of the biggest changes is that Egypt and Turkey have in a way been sidelined from Middle East politics, and the very wealthy oil-rich countries of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and others, have the kind of influence to create circumstances within the wider Middle East that continue to serve their interests. And particularly with respect to Yemen, there's this sense that Turkey has become overwhelmed with the issue across the border in Syria, and that it has to stay focused on that question rather than Turkey and the government in Istanbul using its good offices to try to help bring about some positive settlement within Yemen. And the same thing is sadly true of Egypt, right? That Egypt has just become totally subservient to the monarchies in the Gulf, a very different reality than what used to be in the 1960s, the 1920s
Thank
and
you
30s.
so much. And now I think we need to wrap up the session. I will give not more than 2 minutes for each panelist to wrap up their thoughts.
طبعا بالنسبة للأسئلة اللي طرح
As for the questions that were posed, I would comment on them, not answer them.
The guys, we try to raise their claims in front of the Europeans. I've been living in Germany for 12 years, and I know a little bit how they think. They don't want you to go and give claims to them. They want to offer solutions. If you just claim or complain to them, what do they do? Do you want them to cry with you? They don't feel for the suffering because they see. What they see in Yemen, not between those who are committed a coup and the legitimacy. They see a proxy war between regional powers having interest in Yemen. I think if we want to speak with Europe or with the West, we need to provide solutions. That this is the solution that we see for the Yemeni problem based on these principles: democracy, peaceful share of power sharing, and respect of women. As for the initiative that I have proposed, which is the shadow government, and I believe my colleague here agree with me, that he says that our initiatives from outside Yemen usually fail. Why? What is the alternative now? What alternatives do we have? Just wait something to come up from inside Yemen. In Yemen, the image, unfortunately, is very fragmented. Even in Taz, for example, it is catastrophic. Even there are conflicts on the level of neighborhoods. Maybe they are fighting over the taxations on cuts or other localized issues sometimes. So if we are going to wait for initiatives to come from within Yemen, we will wait for further decades. We need to do something, and to start with attempts, we must not depend on the tools that are already there. There is the international community might help us in about the regional influence, and we need to use that or exploit that opportunity. So we need to come up with initiatives, something that represents Yemenis' interests in a way that is recognized in the West, such as the idea that I came up with, which is the shadow government. William, your turn.
Keep it brief. I think that the challenge is to focus on the energies and the positive areas where things are working. This meeting today is an example. Tawakkol Karman is an example. As I've said earlier, women's groups, women's organizations, local NGOs, people who are engaged in civil society, even at a very, very local level. This is where we need to look, and I think it's an obligation for me as a journalist to look at these people who are moving it forward, to try and find those places where we can advance the cause for peace.
Okay, to wrap up the thoughts and...
Well, I think the international community, I mean, I don't want to speak for Yemenis myself, but the international community should give more of a voice to Yemeni organizations, independent ones, and civilians to actually bring about a solution for their country. This has been a failure of past peace talks. I mean, if you look at the Stockholm agreements, it had ignored the issue of, even though the STC is, as I've said, a UAE-backed force, it still ignored the southern issue. So that's why the conflict had actually erupted in August last year, because this was under-addressed. And then the separatists felt that since they weren't actually being given a say, they would actually push out and just lash out at the government, and that's what we saw. And I think with continued flawed peace efforts like this, which are just serving the interests of regional parties, particularly with the Riyadh agreement, that's just going to cause more and more friction. So what we will do So I think Western journalists like myself and Bill should do what we can to raise awareness about this in our own countries, because this is really a significant factor that's driving the tension on.
Okay, thank you so much. We will
Yeah,
end up with...
I think that one of the best things to do to keep that door open, that there can be some way to bring about a change in the near future, is the National Dialogue Conference, the outcomes of that, to keep emphasizing this point that there was a dialogue, there was a debate, there was a discussion about that. There's a way to build a future for Yemen around some of the conclusions that came out of the National Dialogue Conference. And obviously, as I said, the point that for the longest time I have emphasized is that question of federalism. Keep emphasizing that point. There has to be an insistence on the part of actors at the global level and at the regional level, as well as keep emphasizing that the Houthis have to come around to accepting this idea that there needs to be room for decentralized decision-making within the country and build consensus around that idea. I think Yemenis outside the country can help do that. I think you can find partners certainly at a global level, at the United Nations, to do that. The question is, can you get these regional actors that are working with proxies inside the country to accept that? But I would say that's the best chance, is to build some momentum around those ideas.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like to thank our esteemed experts, and this is very enlightening, and I would like to thank our audience, and like this we close this session.